Lieutenant Mira Khan stood motionless beneath the blazing sun, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon as the rotors of the waiting gunships churned. The thick air at the base was charged with an unspoken tension, unlike anything she had felt in months. The northern front had been quiet for weeks, but this morning something had changed. The usual hum of routine drills was replaced by urgent whispers and hurried footsteps as soldiers and officers moved with a purpose that seemed almost frantic. Everyone was waiting for the briefing that would explain the sudden alert, but no one was ready for the storm that was about to descend inside the cramped briefing room. Mira adjusted the straps of her flight jacket, trying to steady her breathing, despite the heat. The weight of her helmet rested heavy in her hands as she glanced around at her fellow pilots. The squad looked sharp in their uniforms, but the worry in their eyes betrayed their calm facades. Captain Reynard stood at the front of the room, his posture rigid and commanding. His jaw was clenched as he scanned the faces before him. The man was known for his uncompromising standards and his intolerance for mistakes, yet today there was something harsher, something colder, in his gaze that made the air crackle with unease. The murmur of conversations died down instantly as the captain raised his hand, signaling silence. He didn't smile or offer the usual encouragement. Instead, he spoke with a voice that sliced through, the tension like a blade. There was a demand, a command that no one expected, and when Mira was called forward, the room seemed to hold its breath. Time slowed as all eyes turned toward her heart pounding in her chest. She stepped forward from the line, her boots barely making a sound on the concrete floor. The captain's piercing eyes locked on hers. His words came sharp and direct. "You are to stand down from the upcoming mission." The silence that followed was deafening. The shock rippled through the room as murmurs spread like wildfire. What did it mean? Why was Mira the only one being pulled from a mission she had trained for and prepared to lead? Mira's mind raced, trying to piece together what could have led to this sudden decision. Her reputation had always been impeccable, her skills unmatched. But the captain's order left no room for explanation or argument. Instead, Mira simply nodded and turned away. Her silence was a statement louder than any words could be. And as she walked out of the hangar, the weight of eyes on her back was almost unbearable. No one could guess what she was thinking or what she would do next, but everyone knew that something profound had just shifted beneath the surface. Outside the walls of the base, the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the dusty tarmac. Mira stood alone watching the gunships take off one by one. Each roar of the engines felt like a reminder of what she was missing. The squad would be heading into dangerous territory without her. And despite the fire in her veins, she remained still. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as the captain's words echoed in her mind. "You are to stand down." No one knew why, but Mira's silence held a promise that this was far from over, and that her story was only just beginning. The wind picked up, carrying dust and whispers through the empty corridors of the base, and as the last helicopter disappeared into the horizon, Mira turned away, ready to face whatever storm lay ahead, without a single word spoken. The day after the mission orders changed, Mira sat alone in the dimly lit briefing room, the walls cold and unforgiving as the early morning light barely filtered through the thick blinds. She was grounded, forbidden to fly, and the reason remained a mystery. Not even the closest of her comrades had been given an explanation. The air in the base was thick with speculation, yet Mira did not speak. She had learned long ago that silence could be a weapon, sharper than any words, and so she kept her thoughts locked inside like a fortress. Nobody could breach. The captain's decision echoed like a silent thunderstorm reverberating through every corner of the squadron. Whispers floated through the mess. All the corridors and even the flight decks as soldiers tried to decipher what had prompted the sudden demotion of their most skilled pilot. Some said it was politics. Others hinted at a mistake during training that was quickly covered up, but none of these theories fit the sharp precision with which Mira executed every mission. Her record was spotless, yet Captain Reynard's face when he ordered her to stand down was like a stone carved from ice, unmoving and unreadable. Mira watched the squad prepare for the mission she was banned from leading. The junior pilot assigned in her place moved with eagerness, yet lacked the quiet confidence that Mira had earned through countless hours above the clouds, the very thought of another taking. Her place burned a slow fire inside her chest, but outwardly she remained calm, a statue in a storm of doubts. Her silence was not defeat. It was a calculation, a quiet promise that she was far from finished with the fight. As the countdown to takeoff began, Mira gathered her gear not to fly, but to monitor the mission from the ground. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she adjusted her comms headset and sat before the glowing screens of the control room. The buzzing of radios, the sharp barked orders, and the crackle of static filled the air, but behind the chaos, Mira's mind was focused, razor sharp. She was watching for any sign of trouble, ready to leap into action, despite the captain's command to stay put. Suddenly a signal pinged across the radar. A flicker of movement deep within the border zone, where no enemy forces were supposed to be. Mira's eyes narrowed her instincts, screaming that something was wrong. The junior pilot's voice crackled through the radio, reporting nothing unusual. But Mira felt the weight of an unseen danger pressing down like a shadow stretching across the landscape. Her breath hitched as she realized that the threat was closer than anyone suspected, and yet no one was listening to the silent alarm. Ringing in her mind, frustration twisted inside her, but Mira held it back, knowing that rash words could only worsen her situation. She glanced at the clock and then at the control panel, her fingers poised, ready to override protocols if necessary. Her silence was no longer passive. It was a challenge, a test of patience in a game where every second could mean the difference between life and death. The room buzzed with tension, and no one could say what Mira would do next, but they all sensed the calm before the storm. Outside the base, the wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of engines approaching fast and low. Mira's heart pounded in her chest as the first reports of unidentified aircraft filled the comms channels. They were moving. Beneath the radar, invisible to most sensors, yet impossible to ignore for anyone with her experience. The tension in the control room grew palpable as Captain Reynard's voice cut through the noise, ordering a lockdown and scrambling fighters, but Mira knew those seconds were not enough. Without a word, she stood and moved swiftly to the hangar, bypassing security checks that had no power over her when she slid into the cockpit of her assigned fighter. Her fingers flew over the controls, her mind clear as glass. The engine roared to life like a beast awakening from slumber, and as the canopy closed over her head, Mira felt the familiar surge of adrenaline course through her veins. It was a silent rebellion against the order that had grounded her, a refusal to stay idle while the enemy crept closer in the shadows. The hangar doors lifted slowly, revealing the dawn sky painted with streaks of fire and steel. Mira taxied onto the runway, eyes scanning the horizon for the first sign of threat. The ground crew watched in stunned silence, their orders forgotten, as the once grounded pilot took to the skies alone, a lone wolf defying the chain of command. The radio was silent except for the distant crackle of the captain demanding a return. But Mira's response was nothing more than static and the unspoken promise of a fight that would not end quietly. As the sun climbed higher, the battle began, and Mira's silence was shattered by the roar of engines and the flash of missile trails. Her calculated defiance was a beacon of hope in the chaos, a silent signal that even in the darkest moments, courage could rise unannounced. The mission that had tried to sideline her had instead ignited a fire that would burn far beyond the limits of the sky, leaving everyone wondering what she would do next and how far she was willing to go to protect what mattered most. The morning after Mira took to the skies alone, the base was in turmoil and the hum of anxious voices filled every room like a rising storm. The commanders huddled in tense clusters behind closed doors, the air thick with unease and questions that had no clear answers. Every screen flickered with radar blips and live feeds as the aftermath of the unexpected solo flight unfolded. No one could deny the courage it took to defy direct orders, but the ramifications rippled far beyond the limits of the hangar walls. Mira had vanished from the base after the skirmish. No call, no explanation. Only the echo of her silent defiance hanging heavy in the minds of everyone who had witnessed her flight. The squad was fractured with uncertainty. Some saw her as a hero. Others whispered of recklessness and insubordination. Captain Reynard paced in his office. His hands clenched into fists as the weight of command pressed down harder than ever. He knew the truth behind Mira's actions was locked somewhere deeper than just obedience or defiance, but revealing it could shatter the fragile trust in the chain of command. Meanwhile, far from the base, Mira found herself in a hidden outpost, deep within the borderlands, a place few knew existed. A dimly lit room lined with maps and surveillance screens was her new command center, but it was a far cry from the cockpit she loved. The silence here was different, colder, like the breath of a ghost watching and waiting for the next move. She studied, the flickering images tracing the movement of hostile units in the shadowed valleys and dense forests where no satellite dared to linger. Her fingers traced the edges of the terrain as memories of the flight flooded back. The rush of the engines, the weightlessness of the climb, and the sharp snap of danger as she intercepted enemy drones moving under stealth cover. It had been a gamble, one that could have cost her everything, but it was also a revelation revealing an enemy tactic so advanced. It threatened to unravel the entire defense grid. The quiet threat had been hidden beneath layers of deception, a silent whisper in the chaos that only someone like Mira could hear. Back at the base, speculation reached a fever pitch as intelligence. Reports trickled in confirming unusual enemy activity in the sector Mira had flown into. Her decision to engage alone had bought precious minutes for the defenders to mobilize, but questions still lingered. Why had the command structure chosen to ignore her expertise? Why had they forced her into silence when the threat was clearly escalating? The answers were buried deep in political games and hidden agendas that Mira now knew were far more dangerous than any enemy fighter as she prepared new strategies for surveillance and response. Mira's thoughts drifted back to Captain Reynard, the man who had ordered her grounded and now faced the consequences of her actions without fully understanding them. She knew the tension between them was more than just authority versus rebellion. There were secrets. They both held secrets that, if revealed, could change everything about the war and their places in it. The silence between them was a battlefield in itself, and Mira wondered if they could ever find common ground again. Her comms crackled, suddenly, breaking the stillness with a voice she had not heard in days. A coded message from an unknown source hinted at a deeper conspiracy unfolding within the ranks. A mole feeding information. To the enemy, someone with access to classified intel that could explain the orders against her. The implications sent a cold shiver down her spine and pushed her to dig deeper, risking everything to uncover the truth. Hours turned into days as Mira pieced together fragments of data following a trail that led her closer to the heart of betrayal. The line between friend and foe blurred as she realized that the war was not only being fought on the battlefield, but inside the very walls meant to protect them. She moved like a shadow, working in silence, trusting no one as the stakes climbed higher with every passing moment. Back at the base, Captain Reynard faced his own demons as reports of Mira's unauthorized flight sparked both outrage and admiration. His superiors demanded answers and accountability, but the captain was torn between loyalty to the chain of command and the undeniable truth that Mira had saved countless lives. His thoughts churned with doubt and regret, and he began to question the orders he had given and the real cost of obedience in a war where silence could mean death. The tension reached a breaking point when a sudden enemy incursion in Sector 14 threatened to overrun a key communications hub. The base scrambled jets and troops, but the lack of precise intel hampered their response. As the situation grew desperate, a familiar signal pierced the static on the comms. A call sign that made every soldier freeze for a moment. It was Mira broadcasting, from deep behind enemy lines offering critical coordinates and guidance for a counterstrike. The command room erupted into chaos as orders shifted rapidly, trying to coordinate a rescue and support mission. The captain barked commands with a new urgency driven by a mixture of fear and hope. But the question remained, how long Mira could hold her position isolated and vulnerable. Her silence during the flight had been a mystery, but now her voice carried a message of defiance, determination, and an unyielding will to fight for her comrades, no matter the cost. As night fell over the base, the stars above seemed indifferent to the battles raging below. Mira stared out from her hidden post, the cold wind biting at her face, but her resolve burning bright. She knew the path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but retreat was not an option. The silence that had once been her shield was now a weapon, a means to uncover a conspiracy that threatened to destroy them all from within, and she was ready to face whatever shadows lurked in the darkness, no matter the price. The base was on high alert as dawn broke, casting long shadows over the runway, and the rows of sleek fighter jets lined up like silent sentinels ready to respond to the unseen threat. The tension was tangible, like a tightly coiled spring ready to snap, and every soldier felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on their shoulders. Captain Reynard stood rigid in the command center, his eyes fixed on the screens displaying live feeds from reconnaissance drones and radar blips that pulsed like faint heartbeats in the vast expanse of the borderlands. The recent events had shattered the illusion of control and left the entire unit on edge, waiting for the next move from an enemy that seemed always one step ahead. Mira's voice crackled through the comms, breaking the thick silence with an unexpected calmness that cut through the rising panic. Her tone was steady, clear, and confident, betraying none of the danger lurking just beyond the horizon. She reported hostile units moving stealthily beneath radar detection, using technology so advanced it was nearly invisible even to the most sophisticated sensors. Her knowledge of the terrain and enemy tactics was unmatched, and her warnings were a lifeline in the chaotic scramble to defend the perimeter. Yet her presence behind enemy lines raised more questions than answers, especially since she had refused to comply with the direct orders. To return, Captain Reynard's face tightened with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. As much as he resented her insubordination, he could not deny that her information was crucial to the survival of the base. The command room buzzed with activity as operators relayed her coordinates and scrambled jets to intercept the infiltrators. Mira's defiance had become the catalyst for a coordinated defense that might otherwise have collapsed under the surprise assault. But the cost was still unknown, and the captain wrestled with the implications of losing control over one of his best pilots. The air grew thick with anticipation as fighters roared into the sky, racing to intercept the shadowy enemy crafts. Mira's single fighter cut through the clouds with precision, weaving through narrow mountain passes and using the terrain as cover. Her maneuvers were flawless, but the enemy was relentless, employing guerrilla tactics that made every engagement a deadly game of cat and mouse. The radio was filled with frantic calls and distress signals as the skirmishes escalated and the ground forces braced for a possible ground incursion. Suddenly, Mira's comms went silent for a heartbeat long enough to send a ripple of dread through the control room. The screens flickered, showing moments of static, and then her voice returned softer but filled with urgency. She had been hit, her fighter trailing smoke and struggling to maintain altitude. The squad held its breath, waiting for her next words, but instead there was only a brief pause, followed by a silence, more telling than any message could be. The fear that she might be lost deepened as rescue teams prepared for a risky extraction mission behind enemy lines. Captain Reynard barked orders, his voice rising above the chaos as he coordinated a desperate effort to locate Mira and provide air support. She was a ghost on the radar. A flicker of hope and danger intertwined as the teams pushed into hostile territory, racing against time and the advancing enemy forces. Every second stretched into eternity as they searched the rugged landscape for any sign of the downed pilot. Meanwhile, back in the command center, tension mounted as they monitored the deteriorating situation, unable to predict the outcome or the price they might pay. Mira's perspective shifted to the cockpit, the confined space filled with the acrid smell of burning circuitry and the relentless hum of damaged systems. She fought to keep control her mind, razor sharp. Despite the pain and exhaustion, her silence on the radio had been a choice, a calculated decision to avoid revealing her exact location to the enemy. Her instincts screamed at her to survive, to hold on until reinforcements arrived, but the weight of isolation pressed down crushingly. She was alone in the eye of a storm, with nothing but her training and will to keep her alive. Outside the canopy, the sky darkened with gathering storm clouds mirroring the turmoil within Mira's mind. The enemy was closing in, relentless and methodical, and she knew the coming hours would test every ounce of her skill and determination. The terrain was unforgiving, steep cliffs and dense forests that could be both shield and prison, depending on the moves she made. Each heartbeat was a countdown, and every breath a silent prayer as she prepared for what could be the final confrontation. Back at the base, Captain Reynard paced the command center, his thoughts a chaotic storm of regret and resolve. He replayed the moment he had ordered Mira to stand down over and over, wondering if his decision had put her in this peril. He knew the chain of command was strict, but the battlefield was never clean, and sometimes rules had to bend in the face of harsh realities. The respect he held for Mira was mixed now with fear that losing her might unravel everything they were fighting to protect. The night stretched on with agonizing slowness as the rescue teams advanced into the darkness, guided by Mira's last known coordinates. The ground was treacherous, and every shadow seemed to hide unseen dangers. The soldiers moved with caution but urgency, their radios filled with fragmented updates and static as they tried to maintain contact with command. The stakes had never been higher, and the silence from Mira lingered like a haunting echo, urging them forward, despite the growing risks. Suddenly, a faint signal broke through the noise, a crackled transmission barely audible, but unmistakably Mira's voice. She was alive, wounded, but fighting her way to a concealed vantage point, ready to relay vital intel to turn the tide of the battle. Her survival was a beacon of hope, lighting the way through the darkest hours, and her silent courage was a testament to the strength that had defined her from the start. Yet the question remained how long she could hold out and what sacrifices would be demanded before the dawn. The final hours before sunrise were a relentless test of endurance for both Mira and the teams searching for her. The clash between light and shadow mirrored the conflict raging within each soul caught in the deadly game of survival and strategy. Every decision carried weight, every movement could mean life or death, and as the horizon began to glow with the first hints of dawn, the base held its breath, waiting for the outcome of a battle fought not only in the skies, but in the silence between orders and defiance, where a single pilot's will could change everything. The dawn broke slowly, spilling pale light over the battered landscape as the base held its breath, waiting for news of Lieutenant Mira. Khan. The silence that had hung heavy for days now felt electric, charged with hope, fear, and the weight of unspoken questions. The air was thick with anticipation as soldiers gathered near the communication arrays, their eyes fixed on flickering screens, awaiting the return of the pilot who had defied orders and flown into the jaws of danger alone. The hangar bay was quiet, except for the low hum of machinery and the distant echo of footsteps that seemed to carry the pulse of a story far. From over inside the command center, Captain Reynard stood rigid, his gaze locked on the data streaming across the monitors. His face was a mask of tension and uncertainty, the lines of command and loyalty tangled in a web of regret and reluctant admiration. He replayed every moment since Mira's unauthorized flight, every order given and every command ignored, wondering how a single act of defiance could ripple through the fragile balance of trust and control, the silence that once divided. Them now echoed with a new understanding born from the crucible of battle and sacrifice. Outside the base, a convoy of armored vehicles rumbled over rugged terrain. The rescue team moving with cautious urgency, guided by the faint signals Mira had transmitted. The landscape was scarred from recent clashes, and every shadow seemed to conceal a threat, but the soldiers pressed on, driven by the determination to bring their comrade home. Their radios buzzed with fragmented reports and anxious voices, yet none dared break the fragile thread of hope woven through the chaos. The tension was palpable as each mile brought them closer to the pilot, who had become a symbol of silent strength and unyielding will. Meanwhile, Mira herself lay hidden. In a shallow ravine, her body battered and bruised, her breath shallow but steady. The cold seeped into her bones, yet her mind remained sharp. Her eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of movement, she was acutely aware of the thin line between life and death, the fragile thread that held her existence together. Yet despite the pain and exhaustion, her spirit burned with a fierce determination. She had survived the ambush, used every ounce of skill and instinct to evade capture, and now waited for the moment when she could rejoin the fight and reclaim her place among her squadron A's. The rescue team closed in. Mira reached for her comms unit and sent a brief transmission confirming her position and status. The response was immediate. A chorus of relief and renewed urgency echoed through the command center and the convoy alike, but the danger was far from over. The enemy had not given up the hunt, and every second that passed heightened the risk of discovery and confrontation. Delicate balance between hope and despair wavered like a candle flame flickering in the wind. Captain Reynard coordinated the extraction with a steely resolve, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. He deployed air support to cover the ground, teams, and monitored every movement through the tactical displays. His orders were precise and unwavering, yet beneath the surface lay a profound respect for the pilot who had defied him, and in doing so had saved countless lives. The bond forged in silence and battle was intangible but undeniable, and it reshaped the very fabric of command and camaraderie. The terrain grew more treacherous as the soldiers navigated steep cliffs and dense underbrush, their senses heightened and every sound amplified. The night air was thick with tension as they moved with calculated caution, the threat of ambush looming like a dark specter lurking just beyond sight. Suddenly, the crackle of gunfire shattered the stillness, and the team dropped into cover, exchanging rapid bursts of suppressive fire. The rescue mission had turned into a fight for survival, a desperate struggle against an enemy determined to claim their prize. Amidst the chaos, Mira summoned her remaining strength and moved with silent agility through the shadows, her training and experience guiding her steps. She reached a narrow ledge overlooking the skirmish and relayed critical tactical information to the rescue team, helping them to flank the enemy and gain the upper hand. Her voice was calm, steady, a beacon of leadership despite the pain that radiated through her body. The firefight intensified. But with Mira's guidance, the soldiers pushed forward, their determination unbroken by the danger surrounding them. The battle raged through the night, a fierce clash of wills and weapons, each moment a test of endurance and courage. As dawn crept closer, the enemy began to falter their coordinated attacks, losing momentum against the combined efforts of the rescue team and the pilot who had refused to be silenced. The base held its collective breath, waiting for the final outcome. The lines between victory and defeat blurred in the haze of gun smoke and fading darkness. Finally, the extraction team reached Mira. The sight of her battered form ignited a surge of relief and determination among the soldiers. They moved quickly, securing the area and preparing for the return journey, every movement a race against time and exhaustion. The wounded pilot was lifted carefully into the armored vehicle, her eyes meeting Captain Reynard's as the convoy turned back toward the base. The unspoken bond between them was forged in that glance, a silent acknowledgement of respect, redemption, and the cost of defiance. Back at the base, the arrival was met with a mixture of celebration and solemnity. The hangar filled with the hum of medics and the quiet prayers of comrades as Mira was carried inside. The once silent pilot, now the center of attention, her story etched in the faces of those who had waited and feared. The captain stood nearby, his expression unreadable, but his presence a testament to the profound changes unfolding within the unit. His voice finally broke the silence with words of gratitude and recognition that echoed through the room. Mira's journey from silent obedience to defiant hero had changed everything. Her silence was no longer a void, but a powerful statement, a message that courage and conviction could speak louder than orders and hierarchy. The war they fought was far from over. But the story of Lieutenant Mira Khan had become a beacon of hope and resilience, inspiring all who heard it to find strength in the quiet moments before the storm, and to never underestimate the power of a single voice, even when it chooses to speak in silence. As the sun rose higher, casting light over the battered but unbroken base, Mira looked out toward the horizon, her gaze steady and unyielding. The future was uncertain, the battles ahead unpredictable. But one thing was clear. The silent response to a captain's demand had left everyone stunned and changed the course of their fight forever. Her story was a reminder that sometimes the loudest answer is found not in words, but in action, and that true leadership often speaks best when it refuses to be silenced.